Welcome to Life Stories, where we share the unforgettable tales that inspire and teach us about the deeper meanings of life. Today, we have a story that will remind you of the power of humility, vision, and perseverance. It's about an old man, a forgotten dream, and the bank that once belonged to him. His story will not only leave you in awe, but also make you reflect on the true value of what we build in life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to begin today's story with us. Let's dive in. It was one of those quiet afternoons in Maplewood, a small, tucked-away town in the heart of the countryside. The streets were bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun, the kind that stretched long, delicate shadows over everything in its path. Life here was simple, predictable. Nothing much ever seemed to happen in Maplewood, nothing that would make the front page of a newspaper at least. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the bustling of life's demands faded away into the gentle rhythms of small-town living. People knew each other's names, and the most exciting event in the week was the farmers' market on Saturdays. But that afternoon, that was all about to change. I was standing in the lobby of the Maplewood Chase Bank when the doors creaked open. The sound was sharp, unexpected, cutting through the hum of soft conversations. A figure appeared, standing at the entrance, a figure that seemed as out of place in this polished, professional environment as a storm cloud in a clear blue sky. The man was old, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a worn, faded cap, his body hunched with age and weariness. He was carrying a large sack over his shoulder, the rough fabric stained and frayed, a stark contrast to the shiny marble floors and pristine counters inside the bank. The few customers in the lobby didn't even look up at first. It wasn't that they were rude. It was just that Maplewood was a quiet town, and people were used to seeing the occasional eccentric wander through. We've all seen our share of oddities after all. The bank workers behind the counters exchanged knowing smiles, as if to say, "Here we go again." They'd seen all sorts of things: the lonely widow coming in to cash her husband's pension check, the young couple setting up their first savings account, the farmers coming in to deposit the week's earnings. But none of them had seen a man like this before. The old man shuffled slowly to the center of the room, his movements deliberate but labored. There was something almost dignified in the way he held himself, despite the age and the ragged clothes. And then, as if he had been waiting for the right moment, he lifted his head, revealing eyes that shimmered with a quiet intensity. There was something about those eyes that made you stop, something that spoke not of age or weakness, but of life, of stories untold, of experience etched deeply into the soul. "I am the owner of this bank," he said, his voice calm, almost serene. It wasn't loud or demanding, but it carried a weight that immediately silenced the room. For a moment, there was stillness. It hung in the air like a cloud that had yet to break, a silence thick with disbelief. The words sank into the atmosphere, slowly at first, like ripples on a pond, until they were met with a small chuckle, and then another. Soon, laughter began to spread through the room like wildfire, a ripple effect that was impossible to stop. The old man's declaration seemed so absurd, so out of place, that even the most composed of us couldn't help but laugh. A security guard, a towering man with broad shoulders and a badge that read Tom, stepped forward, folding his arms over his chest. His expression was a mixture of amusement and curiosity, as though he were unsure whether this was some sort of elaborate prank or simply the ramblings of an old man who had lost his way. "Sir," he said in a deep, firm voice, "I think you're confused. Maybe you should sit down while we call someone to help you." But the old man didn't budge. He stood there, unwavering, his grip tightening around the sack on his shoulder. There was a quiet determination in the way he carried himself. Without a word, he dropped the sack onto the marble floor with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and unyielding, silencing the laughter instantly. The air felt different now. The lightheartedness was gone, replaced by something heavier, more uncertain. The old man's calm voice filled the room once again. "I am not confused," he said. "This bank belongs to me." The people in the room were no longer laughing. The weight of his words hung in the air, as if the very foundations of the bank had been shaken. Even the young teller behind the counter, who had been laughing just moments before, now looked up, her smile fading. She exchanged a quick glance with her colleague, both of them uncertain about what to do next. I remember standing there, watching this unfold, feeling a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was a sense of gravity in the air, like a quiet storm gathering on the horizon. The old man's words lingered, and though we all may have dismissed him as nothing more than a rambling old man, a part of me wondered, what if he was telling the truth? What if there was something to his claim after all? But that thought would have to wait for now. The laughter had stopped, but the questions were just beginning. At first, it wasn't clear whether the laughter was an attempt at amusement or a nervous reaction to the sheer absurdity of the old man's claim. Slowly, chuckles began to ripple through the bank, like a wave that spread across a calm sea. I could hear a few murmurs behind me as customers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others simply turning back to their phones or papers, dismissing him as nothing more than a harmless old man with a questionable sense of reality. The staff, too, couldn't seem to contain themselves. The young teller, no older than 25, leaned over to her coworker, whispering something in her ear while trying to suppress a grin. The woman behind the counter, a clerk named Emma, glanced at her colleague with an incredulous look. And even Frank, the branch manager, a man whose face was usually a picture of calm professionalism, shook his head with an amused sigh. But amid the laughter, there was a sense of discomfort creeping in, a hesitation, as if the mood was shifting from light-heartedness to something heavier. Perhaps it was the sheer audacity of the claim, or maybe it was the look in the old man's eyes, a quiet certainty that made even the skeptical feel uneasy. I noticed the security guard, a large man named Tom, folding his arms as he stepped forward, his expression no longer one of amusement but of a more measured concern. "Sir," Tom said in a voice that was low but firm, "I think you're confused. Maybe you should sit down while we call someone to help you." The old man didn't move. Instead, he adjusted the sack on his shoulder, and in one swift motion, he let it fall to the marble floor with a thud that echoed throughout the lobby. It was a sound so unexpected, so heavy, that it made everyone stop. The laughter stopped too. People turned their attention back to him, as if the weight of the sack had grounded them in a reality they couldn't easily dismiss. The clink of something hard within the sack could be heard faintly, but it only added to the mystery of the moment. "I am not confused," the old man said, his voice now clearer, more resolute. "This bank belongs to me." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, refusing to dissipate. For a moment, the laughter died completely, replaced by a tense stillness. The soft hum of the bank's air conditioning was the only sound that remained. Tom, the security guard, stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had dealt with unruly customers before, hecklers, troublemakers, even the occasional distressed person, but never someone so calm, so composed, and yet so clearly out of place. Frank, the branch manager, sighed deeply and stepped forward. His demeanor shifted from casual amusement to one of professionalism, albeit one that carried a faint edge of disbelief. Frank had seen his fair share of odd situations, but this was new. "Sir," Frank said, his voice patient but firm, "with all due respect, I don't think that's possible." "You must be mistaken." His tone was kind, almost like the way someone might speak to a child who had misunderstood something important. "Do you have an account here?" The old man tilted his head slightly, his wrinkled face unreadable. It was as if he was contemplating the question, as if he had heard the words but wasn't sure whether to respond to them or to something deeper. And then, without skipping a beat, he answered in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "Account?" he asked, almost with a hint of surprise. "I built this bank." At that moment, I swear I could feel the air shift. The casual dismissiveness in the room faded, replaced by something that could only be described as a sense of wonder, maybe even fear. "You see, It wasn't the words themselves that made people stop in their tracks. It was the way he said it. There was no arrogance, no boastfulness, just quiet truth. A man who had built something, and in doing so, had earned a right to claim it. Frank, the branch manager, took a deep breath before stepping forward. His usually composed demeanor was slightly shaken, but his voice was steady as he addressed the old man. He had seen his fair share of eccentric customers over the years, people who seemed to have lost their bearings, or perhaps just found themselves in some kind of confusion. He had always been able to handle these situations with patience, offering gentle guidance, and more often than not, a cup of coffee to calm frayed nerves. But this was different. "Sir, with all due respect," Frank said, his tone polite yet firm, "I don't think that's possible. This is Chase Bank. It's a corporate institution, and we're the branch here in Maplewood. Do you have an account with us?" The old man didn't answer right away. His face was hard to read, wrinkled and weathered by the years, but those eyes never left Frank's. There was a stillness in the air, a tension that seemed to stretch between the two of them like an invisible thread. The bank staff stood behind Frank, watching the exchange, a mix of curiosity and disbelief on their faces. "I don't need an account here," the old man replied after a moment, his voice calm but carrying an underlying strength that made Frank pause. "I built this bank." The words hit the air like a thunderclap, and for a brief second, there was complete silence. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade away, replaced by the heavy weight of his statement. Frank blinked, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. Built the bank? How could that be possible? This was a branch of a national corporation, and no one in the town of Maplewood had ever heard of the old man. The young teller, Emma, leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? You built this bank?" she asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. The old man's lips curled into a slight smile, not one of amusement, but of recognition, as if he knew he had just unlocked a door that few people had the key to. He took a deep breath, then began to speak. "Many years ago," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "there was no bank in Maplewood. This town was growing, but it lacked the infrastructure to truly thrive. I worked for years building, organizing, securing the loans, speaking with investors to make sure this town had what it needed to grow." He paused, his eyes softening. "I invested every penny I had, believing in this town, believing in the people here. I put my heart into this place." Frank stood still, his mind reeling. The story sounded unbelievable, but there was something in the old man's words that struck a chord, a quiet truth that seemed to echo through the years. The old man's eyes flickered with something deeper, something almost wistful. "But the bank changed over time," he continued. "Corporate interests took over, and it became something else, something unrecognizable. The very heart of the place I built has been buried beneath layers of profit and bureaucracy. It belongs to someone else now, just not in the way that it should." The silence in the room was palpable as the staff absorbed his words. It was as though the old man had shifted the entire atmosphere in the bank, making everyone look at the place they worked, the place they trusted, with new eyes. Emma's voice broke the silence, soft but full of empathy. "So you're telling us you were the one who started all this? You were the one who made sure this town had a bank?" The old man nodded slowly. "Yes, I laid the foundation, both for the building and for the community. But over the years, I've become a shadow of that memory, forgotten." His gaze swept over the room, lingering on the polished counters, the sterile, modern decor. "But I am not forgotten, not by the people who remember what this place once stood for." Frank took a deep breath, suddenly understanding that this was not just a man looking for recognition, it was a man carrying the weight of a history that had been lost in the rush of progress. And it was a history that, in some strange way, still lived in him. As the old man finished speaking, the room fell silent once again. Frank stood frozen, processing the gravity of what he had just heard. It felt like time had paused, and for a brief moment, the world outside the bank, the quiet streets of Maplewood, seemed to vanish. The story the old man shared was no longer just a claim, it was a life's work, a testament to sacrifice and dedication. The years, the hardships, the long nights spent building something that would outlive him, it all became clear in that single, quiet moment. Frank blinked, then looked at the old man with new understanding. "You're saying you built this bank from the ground up?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with empathy. The old man nodded, his eyes steady, unwavering. "Yes, with my hands, my heart, and my belief in this town. But over time, the control slipped away, the ownership passed into other hands. Yet, it's still my vision, my dream, living on in these walls." It wasn't just a building he had constructed, it was the foundation of hope, of ambition, and of community. Frank, no longer amused or dismissive, felt a wave of respect wash over him. The old man wasn't just some forgotten relic of the past. He was a part of the very essence of the town, an embodiment of the dreams and struggles that had built it. As the room grew quiet, the weight of the moment settled in. The old man had nothing to prove, no need for validation. His ownership wasn't about wealth or power, it was about heart. He had given everything to see this town thrive. "Thank you for reminding us," Frank said quietly, his voice filled with a newfound reverence. The old man simply smiled, tipped his hat, and picked up the sack from the floor, ready to leave. His purpose had been served, and as he walked out into the fading light of the afternoon, the bank staff stood in awe, humbled by the profound lesson they had just received. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to stay tuned for more life stories that remind us of the deeper truths we often overlook.